feel like I take too much time with these intros because I don't actually have a dedicated intro. So instead of going on a long winded rant about how long I take with these intros, I truncate this intro so that it isn't too long and just say that I waited months for this game to come on PS Plus. And I'm so glad that I didn't cave in and buy it on sale. Now I'm just hoping that Return of the Obra Dinn will also get a PS5 version which becomes part of the Plus lineup. Anyway, this video isn't about games that would be perfect for PS Plus. Oh wait, let me write that down. No, this video is about Ghostrunner, because goddamn is Spirit Sprinter a good game. As usual, I'll start with the spoiler-free section before wall running into a gameplay overview, grappling to a really short story section, and finally sliding into your DMs, into the conclusion. Ghostrunner is a first-person platformer, and if that sounds like a bad idea, it very often is. But Ghostrunner falls into the niche of momentum-based first-person platformers. Think games like Mirror's Edge or Titanfall 2. The aim here is to chain movements to maintain fluidity of motion as you dash from enemy to enemy, taking them out with a single slash of your blade. Each and every single one of the game's mechanics is reactive by its very nature, and considering that you go down in one hit just like your enemies, the game is incredibly punishing and incredibly rewarding once you get the hang of it. There are also accessibility options which can make the game that bit easier for those who may not be able to keep up with the breakneck speed of this title. This game rewards experimentation, and that might sound like a contradiction of the one-hit kill design philosophy, but the generous checkpoints and non-existent load times allow you to get right back into the action. And hey, there's even a press triangle to look cooler button. The backdrop in which you slice and dice your way through meticulously placed enemies is a dystopian cyberpunk nightmare, and the synthy soundtrack perfectly complements the neon aesthetic of this game. The story itself leaves a bit to be desired, but the world building here is commendable, and I can't wait for another installment to take me back to Dharma City. I think that the story suffers due to the shorter length of the game, but what could be a glaring flaw instead becomes one of the game's greatest strengths. The shorter length allows the game to introduce new mechanics seemingly at every turn. Seriously, you'll have whiplash from how rapidly this game shifts up its gameplay. And you know what makes this game an even better sell? The fact that it's objectively an easier sell. I mean, it literally costs a fraction of the price of AAA titles and is a much better experience than a lot of them. So if you're willing to adjust to the incredibly steep learning curve of this game, or if you're at all compelled by its cyberpunk aesthetic, I'd say you should get it without a second doubt. Just make sure that you switch to performance mode if you're playing on the PS5. I made the mistake of keeping ray tracing on, which led to some of the latter sections of this game to completely crash my PS5 software, which led to an error screen that I had never even seen before. At least it taught me that my $500 console that is literally impossible to find can break in ways I hadn't even thought of. The more you know. Alright, that's the end of the spoiler-free section. Leave if you want to play the game yourself, which I implore you to do. To those who remain, let's talk about the traversal first. Movement is the bread and butter of this game. You're expected to maintain a fluid motion to gain more and more speed as you go, and the game gives you a number of different methods to maintain this momentum. Along with the normal running, you also have a grapple mechanic, wall running, a time-bending dash, zip lines, a really cool slide, and later on, the option to jump on top of drones to crash them into your enemies. Of all of these, my least favorite is definitely the zip line. See, all of these work really well and allow you to approach each level in unique ways. You almost always have the option to switch between different movement systems, and you have quite a bit of autonomy in when you wish to switch from one to the next. With zip lines though, this is taken away. You're literally put on rails, and damage that you might take on zip lines is much harder to avoid as a result. Also, there were moments when I thought I was going to make it to a particular zip line, but I would just overshoot a little bit and fall into the abyss. One way of reducing this frustration could be to have a dedicated button that you need to hold when you are on zip lines. This would make it easier for the game to recognize when you wish to interact with the zip lines, and hand some control back to the player as well. Another mechanic that I had a slight gripe with was the wall run. I will start off by saying that this is a nitpick more than anything. The wall running in this game is better than any game I have played previously. It's responsive and not as finicky as it can be in other titles. However, the final cyber void section of the game forces you to chain a lot of wall runs together, and this led to some gamer rage from me whenever I miraculously found myself on the opposite side of the platform that I wanted to be wall running on. The really quick build up of momentum simply did not help with this. I mean, I like to be fast, but not so fast that I can't even think about my next move when I'm suspended in space, trying to jump from one narrow platform to the next. But overall, all of the movement systems the game implements work really, really well, and chaining moves together without stopping gives you a high like no other. That's right, suck it, Sonic. But it's not enough to just weave your way up the gorgeous environments of the tower. After all, even the blue blur needed some enemies to spice up his games. Combat in this game is so ridiculously unique. I mean, sure, a lot of the standard enemy types that you have come to expect in video games can be found here, but the way that they are used here is remarkable. You go down in one hit and so do your foes, and that adds so much tension to each and every single encounter, even if you're going up against your entry level grunts. The enemy placement in each combat arena makes each room a puzzle. You need to figure out the best, most optimized way to take out each enemy in a room. Of course, finding the best route to take is only part of the solution. You also need to be able to execute your rampage flawlessly. To help you in your quest to become the optimized murder sort of human that you were always meant to be, the game also grants you certain abilities that you unlock as you advance. The issue with these abilities, 3 of the 4 that you unlock have the exact same use case, they just look different. The first one you unlock is Blink, which needs you to line up some enemies before you take them out. Easier said than done, since asking the enemies to politely line up for you to slaughter them is apparently too big of a request. The second one, Tempest, throws out a blast of wind that kills enemies, immediately rendering Blink useless since it is much easier to get more than one enemy with the wider range of this attack. The third ability, Surge, throws out a wave of energy in the form of a sword slash. Again, it is just a press L3 to win button. Blink is the inferior one of the 3, but there's little difference in how you actually use these abilities. The final one, Overlord, is distinct from the rest as it lets you temporarily turn your enemies against their friends. This one requires you to evaluate which enemy would be best to control in a given situation, depending on their relative position to the rest and their attack speed. I really like this one, but I wish it had been swapped with Surge in the order in which it was given to the player, given how different it is from the rest. Alongside these abilities, you can also swap in certain upgrades in this Tetris-like grid. It's okay if you leave empty spaces though, because you get a passive bonus. Again, this is such a unique and well implemented mechanic that I just can't help but respect the creative genius of the developers of this game. Anyway, there's one upgrade here that is borderline essential, Deflect. Deflect lets you send your enemies' projectiles right back at them. This helps you get out of sticky situations when you are under fire from many different directions, and also makes life harder for your enemies. Or easier, depending on how you look at it, considering that they don't have much longer to live now that you're sending their bolts back at them. Overall, I think that they did a great job with how these upgrades were handled, but the special abilities do leave much to be desired. But these upgrades aren't the only way that the game helps you best your foes. Oh no, there is trickery going on right in front of your cybernetic eyes that makes you much more efficient at killing these guys. The game never overwhelms you by introducing a lot of enemy types in a single fight. In fact, it gives you opportunities to test the waters with them one-on-one before presenting you with different combinations of enemies with each new type that it introduces, to organically teach you the best way to take these guys out. Again, I just can't compliment the level design enough. To be fair though, the enemy design is also fantastic. There are grunts that shoot at you slowly, grunts that shoot at you rapidly and then slowly reload, enemies with shields, mechs that throw out shockwaves, enemies that use surge against you, sluggers that jump at you, wardens who need to be parried, and splitters who create clones of themselves to also shoot at you. Each enemy type has its own weaknesses, and this prevents the game from ever feeling unfair. You just need to find an opening to counter your enemy's attacks in. I will say that I never quite got how you were supposed to beat the enemies with shields. I sort of just ran around them in circles till they went dizzy and then bonked them on the head. But that might be me being obtuse. Also with the wardens, not only do they force you to wait for them to attack, but on the train level, one of these guys just stood in front of me with no regard for my personal space, doing absolutely nothing because his AI just sort of broke after seeing me up close. Another enemy type that I failed to mention are the Explodey boys. God, I hate these enemies. It makes sense to have these guys appear in simple traversal sections to force you to move quickly as you avoid coming close to them, but in combat sections which require you to kill all other foes before advancing, their inclusion makes no sense. They're really hard to see, and since the wardens basically require you to stand still as you wait for them to make the first move like this is your first date, These guys will sneak up on you and you won't even realize why you died. I've debated merging this and the story section, but I think it makes more sense to talk about the bosses here. This game puts you up against only 3 bosses, but these are 3 damn good bosses. It's hard to call the first one a boss since it's a giant cylinder that just rotates, but it has a health bar, so I guess we'll just roll with it. This fight has 3 phases, 2 of which require you to ascend to the top of the cylinder to play electrician and cut some wiring as you avoid death lasers and shockwaves. The final phase requires you to do something similar, but now on ground level. This boss is fantastic, and I'd argue that it's the best one in the game. Leaping through the lasers is really challenging, even more so once you add the shockwaves to the mix. But the feeling I got on finishing this boss fight was far and beyond what any other game has made me feel when I've beat a boss. This boss fight does make one really strange choice that sticks out like a sore thumb. Throughout the entire game, if you die, the dialogue is not repeated, only any line that was interrupted by your untimely devices. In this fight though, there's one line that keeps repeating every single time that you die as you try to take out the first fraction of the boss's health, and this is infuriating. I turned off the game's audio because I just could not bear to be told about the Amita station being destroyed one more time. The other 2 bosses are definitely less impressive, but they're still pretty fun. The fight against the other Ghostrunner basically combines the warden and the enemy that throws surge at you and forces you to counter each of the boss's attacks before following it to the next platform as it hurls energy waves at you and repeating this process a couple of times. Nothing special, but still really fun. The Mara fight is honestly a bit of a letdown. You really mean to tell me that Doc Ock here killed all those Ghostrunners when she doesn't even understand basic electrical safety? It's still a fun fight, don't get me wrong, but Mara really doesn't seem like the big bad that she has been set up to be, and the horrendous voice acting here actually made me giggle a bit. There are 2 other things that I want to touch on here. First, it's kinda hard to tell when you're in decapitation range. You will almost always underestimate how far your strikes can go, particularly early on in the game. If there was some sort of subtle indication like a faint vibration or some visual cue that made you aware of whether or not you'd be able to kill an enemy by pressing R2, that would be a great quality of life improvement. Another really small thing is the font. It's the font. The font is tiny. I mean, between the minuscule font and the hard to see enemies, this game could double as an eyesight test. It's even weirder when you consider the accessibility options that this game implements. Would it really be so hard to include a font size slider? But these are minor nitpicks. There is still one major issue that you can run into if you play this game with performance mode off though. In the later levels, the game would just randomly hard crash. Sometimes this would be preceded by intense stuttering. Other times it would just crash with no indication of anything having gone wrong. This game has this weird thing where it puts you at the start of a level if you quit mid-level and not at the last checkpoint. This meant that every time it crashed, I was forced to repeat the entire level from start. This led to a lot of frustration and even made me wonder if all Cyberpunk games were doomed to have some technical issues. But since turning on performance mode made any and all technical glitches go away, I won't penalize the game for them. To summarize the previous section, there are some minor faults but the gameplay is solid overall. Story wise though, it's a whole other story. Here's the thing, this game doesn't need the plot to propel you forwards. No, the boost ability is enough for that. But seriously, the game would function just fine without any sort of plot whatsoever. But there is a plot here, and it's not so much that it's underbaked, but more so that it's baked with the wrong ingredients. What I mean is that the individual elements are interesting and they could fit in to make one scrumptious concoction, but as it stands, the cyberpunk inspiration of the game is limited to just aesthetics and not linked to the story in any interesting way. Basically, you're one of many Ghostrunners, these synthesized beings that were meant to maintain law and order. Your comrades were slain in combat against Mara, the autocrat who dethroned the architect and took complete control over the tower, the sole structure that all of humanity resides in because the external environment is toxic. As the last surviving Ghostrunner, it is your job to ascend the tower and take out Mara. There's also this voice in your head which belongs to the architect, and there's also another support character named Zoe who is part of the rebel forces which put you back together after you lost to Mara. The architect needs you to help him because he forgot to back his data up to iCloud, and now he needs you to go to some terminals in the tower to turn auto backup back on in preparation for the final fight against Mara. On the way up, you first realize that the architect isn't sympathetic to the rebels, and then later realize that he's basically as bad as Mara in what is supposed to be a bit of a twist. But seriously, his voice gave it away just from the start. It's so obvious that they might as well have put an announcement sign. Also, I don't know if it's just me, but the architect's whole shtick got old real quick. I just wanted to mute him after the first level. Seriously, shut up, old man. Don't make me put you on the blockchain and sell you as an NFT. Anyway, once you kill Mara, the architect tries to take control over your body, but you defeat him and assert dominance over your frame once more with one of the least threatening lines I have ever heard.
By a mere tool, I forbid you, Ghostrunner. My name is Jack.
I don't know if it's the way the voice actor delivers this line or the fact that his name is Jack, but this just did not land for me. As you can probably gather from what I just narrated, there are interesting parts to the story, but it's pretty mediocre overall. Zoe actually leaves the story partway through and then miraculously reappears for the climax. The world of Ghostrunner seems to be interesting, and the collectibles, which had great replay value by the way, do add to your understanding of the tower a bit, but there's little to no environmental storytelling to speak of. Take this for example. A lot of the artifacts tell you about the gangs that basically run the tower, and how the law enforcers, if you can call them that, abuse their power and end up segregating into gangs themselves. But there is literally nothing in Dharma City that would lead you to believe that this place is anything other than desolate. Even a few different gang insignia sprayed on the walls would go a long way in aiding the story that this game is trying to tell. The game as a whole is just really empty. There's some set dressing, but most of it is pretty uninteresting. There was one place where I saw a parked bike, which just led me to ask myself how the bike's owner got it there in the first place. I mean, there are no roads to speak of. Again, I understand that the primary focus of this game is the combat, and I appreciate that. But if you're going to add some sort of story in, at least make it somewhat interesting or contextualize it a bit better. But speaking of iCloud, or Cybervoid as this game calls it, remember how I said that I would talk about the gameplay and the story in separate sections? Well, I lied. Welcome to the real world, punk. The Cybervoid sections actually house some puzzles. The Cybervoid is like this techno-computer dimension, and it functions really well as a nice change of pace. The puzzles aren't that hard to figure out, and they're generally not given much time to get complex, but their inclusion here is great since it shakes things up even more. The Cybervoid uplinks, which, while not exactly puzzles, also serve a similar function by giving you shurikens or a super jump to play around with, up the gameplay variety even more. Seriously, there's never a dull moment in this game. And I think that we can end on that note. At the end of the day, I could complain about the lackluster story or one or two minor annoyances I faced in this game, but as a whole, it is simply fantastic. It introduces new mechanics all the time, and it's like the design philosophy of this game is reflected in every single aspect of it. I highly recommend that you buy this game. Or play it if you manage to get it for free from PS Plus in March. Now just like and subscribe, and excuse me as I try to make a virtual carbon copy of myself. Just need to learn how to code first.